The rain over Okinawa in June 1945 was relentless. It did not cleanse. It only mixed with the blood and cordite, turning the island's rich red soil into a slick pink paste that clung to everything. For Corporal Samuel Washington of the 96th Engineer Regiment, this mud was the essence of the war. It caked his boots, stained his fatigues, and felt like a physical weight, pulling him down into the island's misery. His unit, composed entirely of African-American soldiers, was tasked with the Sisyphean labor of clearing roads and building temporary bridges in the wake of the infantry's brutal advance. They were the men who made the war machine move, often under fire, their contributions vital but rarely celebrated. The fighting had moved to the southern tip of the island. The Japanese 32nd Army, under the command of General Mitsuru Ushijima, had been squeezed into a final, desperate pocket. But they were not the only ones. Trapped with them were tens of thousands of Okinawan civilians, driven from their homes and now caught between the American onslaught and the Imperial Army's fanatical refusal to surrender. Leaflets dropped by American planes, promising safety in the shattered entrances. A sound stopped them. Not a gunshot, but a weak, human cry. Lieutenant Miller, a fresh-faced officer from Ohio, tensed up. "Davis, get your men ready," he ordered. Sergeant Davis, a man whose face seemed permanently carved into a mask of weary cynicism, just grunted. "Washington, you got the sharpest eyes. Go take a look, but don't be a hero." Sam crept forward, his M1 rifle feeling heavy and useless. The stench grew stronger. Inside the mouth of a smaller cave, huddled in the darkness, was a group of civilians. They weren't soldiers. They were ghosts, gaunt, terrified, and covered in filth. Old men, women, a few children, their eyes wide with a terror that transcended language. Among them, a young woman with matted black hair and dirt smudged across her high cheekbones met his gaze. Her expression wasn't one of hate, but of utter soul-crushing defeat. She held a small dirty rag to the forehead of a feverish child beside her. "They're civilians, Lieutenant," Sam called back, his voice hoarse. "Just people." The process was slow and tense. The civilians were coaxed out with gestures and single words of broken Japanese. They were herded into a temporary holding area, a miserable pen of mud and barbed wire. As Sam stood guard, the rain began to fall again. He watched the woman, Hana, as he would later learn her name was. She sheltered the sick child with her own body, shivering in the cold drizzle. On impulse, Sam unslung his canteen. He walked over, uncapped it, and knelt, offering it to her. Her eyes shot up at him, filled with suspicion, then confusion. He gestured toward the child. Hesitantly, she took the canteen, her fingers brushing his, and gave the child a few precious sips before taking a small, grateful one herself. She looked back at Sam, her gaze lingering for a moment longer than necessary. Then, she gave a slight, formal bow, a gesture of profound respect in a world that had none left. Sam simply nodded, the unspoken gratitude a strange and heavy thing in the suffocating air of war. The days that followed bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of guard duty, labor, and the distant percussive thunder of artillery. The Battle of Okinawa was in its death throes. General Buckner had been killed by artillery fire just days before, a shocking reminder that no one, regardless of rank, was immune to the island's fury. The news of his death cast a pall over the American forces. Yet the grind continued. The civilian holding pen became a part of Sam's daily landscape. He learned that the woman's name was Hana Tanaka. She had been a teacher in Shuri before the invasion turned the ancient city to rubble. He didn't learn this from words, but from the other captives, a few of whom spoke a handful of English phrases. They were pieces of a puzzle he assembled while on his lonely watches. Sam found himself drawn to the silent dignity with which Hana carried herself. In the squalor of the camp, where humanity was stripped to its barest essentials, she maintained a quiet grace. She organized the women, ensuring the children and the elderly got the meager rations first. She cleaned wounds with dirty water and torn fabric, her hands moving with a gentle purpose that seemed entirely out of place. He started saving parts of his sea rations for her, a tin of peaches, a block of chocolate, items that felt like absurd luxuries in this hellscape. He would leave them near the fence post closest to her section during his shift change, never making a show of it. The first time she watched him, her head tilted. The next day, the empty tin was placed neatly back by the post. It became their silent ritual, a conversation held across a wire fence in a chasm of culture and conflict. From the Journal of Corporal Samuel Washington, June 21, 1945, Sergeant Davis asked me why I bother. "They're the enemy, Sam." I told him to look at them. The old man with one leg, the kids with sores on their faces. They ain't the ones shooting at us. They're just caught in the middle, same as us in a way. Back home, Mr. Henderson looks at me with the same hate I see in some of these Marines' eyes when they look at the prisoners. Then I see her, Hannah. She don't look at me like that. She looks at me like I'm a person. It's strange. I feel more seen by this Japanese woman who I can't even talk to than by some of the officers I salute every day. The world's gone upside down. One evening, Lieutenant Miller made his rounds. He saw Sam standing near the fence, watching the prisoners. "Washington," Miller said, his tone sharp. "Maintain your distance. Fraternization with prisoners is a serious offense. We don't know what they're capable of." "Just keeping watch, sir," Sam replied, his voice flat, his gaze fixed forward. Miller stared at him for a moment. "Just remember which side you're on, Corporal." Sam didn't answer. He knew which side he was on. He wore its uniform, fought its battles, but in the quiet moments, watching Hannah tend to her fellow survivors, he wasn't sure what that meant anymore. Their silent communication, a shared can of peaches and a nod of thanks, felt more real than any order he'd been given. The end came abruptly. On June 22nd, the last pockets of organized Japanese resistance collapsed. General Ushijima and his chief of staff, General Cho, committed ritual suicide in their command post on the Mabuni Cliffs, fulfilling their promise to fight to the last. The battle for Okinawa was officially over, but the suffering was not. The island was a ruin, littered with the bodies of over 100,000 Japanese soldiers and an estimated 150,000 Okinawan civilians, almost a third of the population. For the engineers of the 96th, the mission shifted from supporting combat to managing its aftermath. The holding pen where Hannah was kept was being dismantled. The prisoners were to be moved to a larger, more organized internment camp further north. The news spread through Sam's platoon with a sense of relief. The war was moving on. Soon, they'd be rebuilding airfields for the planned invasion of Japan itself. Sam felt a strange knot in his stomach. The thought of the prisoners being moved, of Hannah disappearing into the anonymous mass of displaced people, was unsettling. Their strange, silent friendship had become a small point of light in the overwhelming darkness. On the final day, chaos reigned. Trucks rumbled, NCOs shouted orders, and the prisoners were lined up, their faces blank with exhaustion and uncertainty. Sam was on duty, keeping the perimeter secure. He saw Hannah in the line, the same sick child from the first day now walking beside her, looking frail but alive. She looked thinner than ever, her borrowed army blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. He felt an urge to do something, to say something. The rituals of war and the rules of the army suddenly felt like a cage. He walked along the line, ostensibly checking the fence until he was opposite her. Their eyes met. The noise of the camp, the shouts and the engines, seemed to fade away. "Sam," he said, his voice quiet but clear, He tapped his own chest. "My name is Sam." Hana stared at him. The concept of a name, a personal identifier, felt monumental. In this place they were numbers, prisoners, the enemy. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the simple offering of his identity. She bowed her head slightly, a flicker of a smile touching her lips for the first time. "Hana," she whispered, her voice raspy from disuse. She touched her own chest, mimicking his gesture. For a moment they were not a soldier and a prisoner. They were Sam and Hana. The shared names hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge built over an ocean of violence. Then an MP barked an order. The line lurched forward, and the moment was broken. Hana was swept along with the crowd, but as she moved, she looked back over her shoulder, her eyes holding his until she was lost in the sea of displaced humanity. The trucks were almost loaded. The dust kicked up by their heavy tires mixed with the humidity, creating a gritty haze that coated everything. Sam watched from his post, feeling a profound sense of finality. This was it. The chapter of Okinawa was closing, and everyone in it, willing or not, would be turned over to the next page of the war. He saw Hana being directed toward the back of a large GMC truck. She moved with the same weary obedience as the others, a single figure in a tide of misery. He knew it was against regulations. He knew Sergeant Davis was watching him with a wary eye, and that Lieutenant Miller would have him on latrine duty for a month if he saw. But he couldn't just let her disappear without a final acknowledgement of the strange human connection they had forged. In his pocket was a small bruised orange he'd gotten from a supply crate. He had saved it, not even sure why. Now he knew. Walking with a feigned casualness, as if inspecting the truck's tires, he approached her side of the vehicle. The guards were busy managing the crowd at the front. For a brief second, the chaos provided a shield of privacy. "Hana," he said softly. She turned, her eyes widening in surprise to see him so close. He held out the orange. It was a pathetic offering in the face of so much loss. Her home, her country, her past. But it was all he had. It was a symbol of their unspoken language, of peaches in a tin and water from a canteen. She looked from the orange to his face. She saw not a conqueror, not an enemy, but the man who had shown her kindness when the world had shown her none. Her eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of something far more complex, a desperate, overwhelming gratitude. She took the orange, her small, cold fingers brushing against his. And then, she did something that shattered every rule of war, every racial barrier, every expectation he had ever known. She leaned forward, quickly and deliberately, and pressed her lips to his cheek. It was not a kiss of passion or romance. It was chaste, fleeting, and as shocking as a nearby explosion. It was a gesture of pure, profound humanity. A thank you, a goodbye, an acknowledgement of a shared soul in a soulless place. Sam froze. The world stopped. He could feel the phantom touch of her lips on his skin, a stark contrast to the grit and sweat of the day. He was a black man from Georgia, who couldn't drink from the same water fountain as a white man. He was a soldier, trained to see her people as a faceless enemy. And this woman, this prisoner of war, had just given him the most intimate, human gesture he had received in years. He was utterly, completely speechless. He didn't even notice her being pushed up into the truck. He stood motionless as Sergeant Davis came up beside him, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "Well, I'll be damned, Washington," Davis muttered, his voice a mixture of awe and disbelief. "In all my years." He just shook his head and walked away, leaving Sam standing alone in the dust, the touch on his cheek burning brighter than the Okinawan sun. Sam never saw Hana again. The 96th Engineers moved on, first to rebuild the shattered airfields of Kadena and Yontan, then to prepare for a future that would be violently reshaped in a matter of weeks. In August, President Harry S. Truman gave the order. The world learned new words: Hiroshima, Nagasaki. The planned invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, for which they had been preparing, was called off. The war was over. The journey home was long and strange. The transport ship was a microcosm of America, segregated, loud, and full of men anxious to forget what they had seen. But Sam couldn't forget. He would stand at the rail for hours, watching the endless expanse of the Pacific, his mind replaying that moment by the truck. Hana's gesture had rewired something inside him. It wasn't about love. He knew that. It was about recognition. In that single, fleeting moment, she had not seen a colored soldier or an American GI. She had not seen a uniform or an enemy. She had seen him, Sam, a person who had offered her an orange. For a man who had spent his life being defined by the color of his skin, by the army that segregated him, by the enemy that wanted to kill him, that simple act of being seen was a revelation. It was a truth more powerful than any order, any propaganda poster, any slur. It was the confirmation of a shared humanity that no war, no matter how brutal, could completely extinguish. He didn't know what happened to her. She was likely sent back to whatever remained of her village, to try and build a life from the ashes, just as he was being sent back to a country where he would have to fight different kinds of battles. Their paths, having crossed so violently and so tenderly, would never meet again. But the memory remained. It was a quiet anchor in the turbulent sea of his thoughts. It didn't erase the horrors of Hacksaw Ridge or the red mud of Mabuni. It didn't solve the injustices he knew he would face back home. But it gave him something to hold on to. Final entry from the Journal of Corporal Samuel Washington, somewhere on the Pacific Ocean, September 1945. We're going home. The boys are all celebrating, talking about girls and steak dinners. I should be happy, and a part of me is. But my mind keeps going back to Okinawa, to the rain, to her. That kiss. It wasn't for a soldier, it wasn't for an American. I think it was just for me. A man gives a woman an orange, and she gives him hope. Maybe that's all anyone is really fighting for. Not for countries or flags, but for a moment where someone else sees you. Just you. I have to believe that's enough. He closed the journal, the faint imprint of her touch still a ghost on his cheek, a silent echo in the deafening silence of peace.